Hi, my name is Kate, and I love to read. Like, I was carrying books around with me before Kindles were a thing. So I decided to start a podcast where I interview the authors of some of my favorite books, ask them all of my questions so that I can read between the lines of the books. Welcome back to another episode of Between the Lines. I'm here today with Rob Hart, who is the author of The Paradox Hotel, which was maybe my favorite sci-fi book that I've ever read, or maybe any book that I've read. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and that is really high praise. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I could not put it down. And when I finished it, I was like sitting next to my husband and I was like, that was the most perfect ending I've read in a while, because endings are hard to do. But we'll get to that later in the spoiler section. I don't want to talk about it
Sure.
yet. So, first, I wanted to know a little bit more about you. So, when did you know that you wanted to be an author, or when did you know you wanted to write your first story?
I would say, I was always an artistic kid, and I was always encouraged with my writing in like grade school and in high school, but I was always more of like an artist. I drew a lot. I was like that
Hmm.
kid in class who could draw stuff good. And and I ended
Yeah.
up going into an art conservatory for college, and just when I got there, realized like, wow, this is not for me. Like this is like when I was in an environment doing it full time, I was like, nope. And so I was like 18. I was kind of failing out of college my first semester, and I was like, maybe I should give this writing thing a try, because I dig that, and I've always been pretty
Yeah.
good at that. And I ended up jumping into the journalism program because I figured, like, okay, like this is a practical way to apply writing for now. And I
Hmm.
knew when I was 18, I was like, yeah, it'd be really cool to write novels. I would love to write novels, but it's going to take a little while to get there. So yeah, I figure like I decided I was going to write books when I was 18, and then my first novel came out when I was like 32 or 35. I can't really in my 30s. So yeah, it took a little bit of time.
So, what about it took time? Was it the writing, or was it like getting connected with the right people?
It's a combination of a lot of things because
Mhm.
there's not really an instruction manual on how to do it. Because there's plenty
Yeah.
of like how-to books, and there's classes you can take and people you can work with, but
Hmm.
so much of the process is like discovering your own process and figuring out how to actually do it and finding your voice. And that took a good bit of time. And I wrote one entire novel that I had to burn off because it was terrible. But a lot of authors do that, I think. Like a lot of friends have done that, where it's like your first book is kind of a mess, but you kind of just need to get it out of your system. And
Yeah.
then my first novel that got published was called New York, and that took me like 5 years to write. And now I can like turn around a book in like less than a year because I'm
Okay.
up to like 8 books. I know like what my process is. But for that first one,
Right.
it's tough. You're just trying to kind of figure it out, and and then there's like trying to make the right connections, like meeting people, finding an agent, all that stuff, and it's a
Right.
long, frustrating road. And I was having this conversation with someone recently. They were like, they were kind of like at the start, and they were like, what's the best thing to do right now? I'm just like, be stubborn. Gotta be real stubborn because it's gonna take forever and it's gonna be
Yeah.
really hard and you're gonna get rejected a lot. So if you're stubborn, you'll be okay.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So
Well,
you kind of spent most of it sounds like, figuring out your process. So what
yeah,
is your writing process now? Do you typically know exactly where a story is going, or how do you get started?
yeah, no, I can't even start actually sitting down to write the book until I know where it starts and where it ends. Like I really, really need that, and I outline like crazy. So
Yeah.
I always have like a pretty clear roadmap, which I'm comfortable like diverging as I'm writing. It's sort of like the
Mm-hmm.
way I explain it is that it's like you've got like an old school roadmap that takes you from point A to B, but like halfway there you see a sign for like the world's biggest ball of yarn, and you're like, well, I'm gonna go check that out. And you check it out, and maybe it's
Yeah.
awesome or maybe it's terrible, but you still have the freedom to do that. Um,
Right.
but it's weird. It's like it usually starts with like a stray idea. Like with Paradox Hotel, I literally just had this idea, like, oh, what if there was like a hotel for time travelers, and like that was it.
Yeah.
And then it just slowly became like, okay, like how do I build on this? How do I develop this? And then
Mm-hmm.
finding the underpinning of the idea, and then finding the character, and then kind of once I have those things in the pot, like it all comes together pretty quickly.
That makes a lot of sense. So, do you do any planning for the characters, or how do you develop the characters?
You know, that's kind of the fun thing is that's sort of like the divination in the process where it's like, I had all this stuff set up for like the world of Paradox, and I kind of knew how it was going to look and how it was going to work. And then just one day, had this image of this woman stepping off an elevator in like this big boho hat, and I'm like, oh, there she is. That's my main character. That's
Yeah.
January. And so it just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
smacks me up the side of the head out of nowhere, and that's the moment when I'm like, okay, like I'm ready to do this now. And yeah, it's just it's so weird. It sounds ridiculous, but it also like makes perfect sense in my head.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, especially when you were saying that you outline pretty intensely and like you need to know where it's going. And then I was thinking about the book. There is like so much world building and so many details that I feel like some books that are especially about time travel and then maybe sci-fi where you're kind of world building a little bit, you are going to need to have those details a lot, and then it sounds like the character part is like the more free flowing part for you maybe.
Yeah, yeah, essentially, because it's like, I don't have a deficit of ideas. I've got like a million ideas. It's ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
like whenever I have an idea that I think has like the slightest bit of legs, I create a Google Doc for it so that like if,
Nice.
if more things come to me on that idea, I have a place to like dump information, like news articles or notes or whatever. And I can go through my Google Docs now. I mean, there's stuff that I wrote down like years ago that I don't even remember what I meant now. Like it's just
Oh
like
my
there's one
gosh.
that's like Alien Fight Club, and I'm like, what was that? Like, was I drunk that night? And but it's it's
I mean, it
it's
sounds intriguing.
and maybe it's something I'll end up doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially, it's like sooner or later, like when the characters pop up, that's when I know like because the ideas are essentially useless until you can hang it on like a really good character, because that's kind
Yeah.
of the key is those two things have to be in conversation with each other.
Yeah. I completely agree. There are some books that are like, yeah, the plot was kind of exciting, but I didn't feel connected to anyone. And so then it's like, it doesn't like stick in my mind as much when I'm done reading it. So, how would you describe the Paradox Hotel in a couple sentences?
It's funny. It's such a hard book to describe, but I keep
It
on telling
is.
people, I'm like, well, it's about it's a time travel book, and it's got robots and dinosaurs, and it's also about grief and how hard it is to face yourself, and the general idea is that we're about to privatize time travel, and this woman who's running security at the hotel for time travelers finds a dead body that only she can see, and has to figure out if a crime's been committed or not.
I think that's a good summary. When I was trying to explain it to my husband, I was like, there's so many good things, but I might just have to like read you the summary because I don't know if I could just like free flow explain it to you. But that was a really good summary in my opinion without giving anything important away. You mentioned that like kind of the idea came from just thinking about like what if there was a hotel people stayed at to like then go time travel. Was that the main thing that prompted you to write it, or was there anything else that prompted you to write it?
I mean, it started with the idea, obviously, like that sort of kernel, but then it starts getting into like, okay, like what do I want to unpack about like myself, or what out of my own bullshit do I need to sort of like explore here? Because that's what every
That's
book
cool.
is. It's like the author working through something at a moment in time, and that's
Yeah.
those were just some of the things that were kind of on my mind and that I was grappling with, and it was kind of seeing like how it all came together because like I'm always gonna write stuff that's like anti-capitalism. I think capitalism is a
Right.
bad system and I hate it so much. So my fiction's always going to kind of revolve around that. And then it's also like it was a
Yep.
period of time where I was like accepting the fact that like I needed to get into therapy, that I had like a lot of issues that I needed to address that I was not addressing, and it was this
Yeah.
idea of like having to kind of like sit with yourself and like be self-reflective and see yourself in the mirror. And so yeah, it was interesting. It's like a couple of things are usually like circling at once, and then I just start smashing them together
Yeah.
into a book.
Yeah. That is really cool. And I've been in I was in therapy for years as well. And so there was a lot of the book that was reminding me of myself pre-therapy. So I'm not surprised that it kind of came from a place of that, and that's probably what I really loved about like exploring the kind of the deeper topics around the story as well.
Yeah.
So we are going to talk about spoilers now. So
Cool.
if you have not read the book, just pause and go read it and come back. But if you are here already because you already read it, you can just keep listening. So I kind of brought up the world building, and that I feel like is some of the funnest part of sci-fi books, like reading them and maybe writing them. I'm not sure, but how did you approach like the world building for the Paradox Hotel? Was it kind of a separate process? Like, did you think of like the unstuck terms and the, I don't know how you would pronounce it, but the retronym? Like, did you
Yeah.
think of all of that before it, or did you kind of figure it out as you wrote it?
It was mostly before it. So the retronym is actually was a phrase that I kind of like pilfered. It's actually like an actual thing. It's a concept. I forget what the meaning of it is, but I was like, oh,
Oh,
that's a great name for a medication. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it was. I did a lot of reading about. I mean, I've always been like interested in quantum physics, and time travel and stuff.
Hmm.
Like not to the point where I'm any kind of expert, but certainly like I've picked up books on it here and there. And so I did a little bit more
Yeah.
research about time, about how time affects the mind and stuff like that.
Hmm.
In terms of like the facility itself, like I drew a map. Like I went out and found a
Oh,
hotel that
yeah.
I thought would be like a good stand-in that had a good look, which was the TWA Hotel at JFK.
Okay.
Because it's like this great mid-century modern design. So it's like kind of like Mad Men. So it's like kind of retro
Yeah.
but kind of current and futuristic at the same time.
Hmm.
So that I drew my own map of what the hotel should look like, and then I sat down and started like trying to figure out what time travel should look like in this world because it's got to be my version. And
Yeah.
that was hard because time travel is complicated.
Yeah.
And I found that the more limitations I gave myself, the easier it was because at one point I
Okay.
decided, you know what, like in this reality, we know how to go back in time, we don't know how to go forward in time. And once I figured that out, it was like, oh,
Hmm.
that just took half my problems off the table. So
Right.
it's a very evolving process of like, starting with like, okay, like we invent time travel, what's going to happen? And then thinking of it
Right.
of like a funding and a regulatory perspective where it could kind of be like,
Hmm.
space travel, where it started as a scientific endeavor and then it got perpetually underfunded over the years, and now private industry is trying to get into
Hmm.
it. But like,
Yeah.
guys like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, like they're not getting into space travel because they want to send rich people on like 10-minute flights up into space. They're doing it because like there are so many ways to monetize space. Like this
Right.
is they're basically trying to conquer a new frontier of money making. So it's like, okay, cool, like
Yep.
all that, how do we translate that to time travel? And I found that it
Hmm.
actually like there was a really nice strong parallel there.
There was a part where I even like highlighted it just because it was interesting, kind of to your point there, where they were talking about how the main reason that they were needing to be bought out is like that we were in so much debt and that China was needing us to pay back and we needed to find a way to get a lot of money into the government. And I was like, well, that sounds pretty familiar to what's happening right now.
Yeah, yeah, and look, I don't want to get too deep down the political well here, but like it's a
Right.
fairly standard tactic, especially among like Republicans and conservatives, to like underfund something until it
Hmm.
doesn't work, so that they can make the argument that it ought to be privatized. Like that's basically what's been happening with
Yeah.
the postal service for the last couple of years.
Right. Right. Yeah, you definitely were able to kind of. I get to when you said earlier you are not a fan of capitalism. I was like, I'm not totally surprised from
Yep,
what I read.
yep.
But it was a really good like exploration of that as well. So it is a really thrilling sci-fi story, but there is like very much an exploration of grief. And so January is kind of just throwing herself into her work and being really abrasive with everyone to try to like hide from her pain, even though that's not really working. So, what prompted you to include that whole exploration of grief in the story?
Well, dealing with time travel, I kind of got fascinated by this idea of like not having to let go and like having these ghosts around you of your previous life that like you can just sort of revisit,
Hmm.
and like what that would do to a person. And
Yeah.
it's just and grief is always like a fun thing to play with, and it's always fun to write a character who's like kind of a jerk, but has a good heart.
Yes.
And That's kind of my wheelhouse. Is I love like like really acerbic narrators.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's like time travel just seemed like a really good example for how like we have a hard time facing ourselves and facing our past, and like what if those things were like constantly thrust in our face? Like how much harder would it
Yeah.
be?
Yeah. I think that was it, because I was thinking about how difficult that would be. And she's like, literally, she has so many people telling her it's probably not safe for her to be there anymore. But she's like, but this is my one connection to her still. So
Yeah.
she almost can't do something that she maybe needs to do for herself because she is stuck to the past, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something like, and I wish I could remember who said this because it was so brilliant, and I repeat it constantly, and I
Hmm.
always precursor it because like it's not my idea. I just want to make it clear because it's just so
Yeah.
brilliant. But like
Yeah.
once saw someone say that like any story a character can walk away from, a reader can walk away from, and it was a really good way to kind of trap January, where it's like, yes, every
Yeah.
single there are so many reasons that she should not be there, and but you also
Right.
can't blame her for staying.
Yeah. Yeah. You really can't, because like you really don't want her to leave either.
Yeah.
And so you do also incorporate some Buddhist elements into it. So you're kind of weaving in some of the principles of it. Like she's hearing Mina tell them to her. So you're kind of hearing it through the story. And then what like kind of blew my mind, because I just wasn't expecting it necessarily, was how it was kind of like going through January's own enlightenment or achieving her own nirvana is actually like the main journey of her character. And that was what I loved about the ending. Did you know when you started the book that that was kind of like a general arc that you were going to want to include?
Oh yeah, yeah. In addition to being really interested in quantum physics, I've also always been interested in Eastern philosophy and Buddhism, and
Yeah.
it really seems to me that there is some like intertwining there of like some of the concepts. And there's
Hmm.
actually a really good book about it called The Quantum and the Lotus, which is one of the books I read
Okay.
in anticipation of this. But there are
Nice.
things that kind of like really dovetail nicely from each other. So I wanted to kind of play with this idea
Yeah.
of like something that was like very scientific but very spiritual, and to kind of
Yeah.
like just swim between those two things and show the parallels between them.
That now I have a new book I need to read.
It's a good one.
But I really it really did feel like both of those things were almost like always happening in the book. And then there's also, it sounds like you kind of chose not to have people go into the future just to make the writing process easier.
Yeah,
But there is like, because that's what you have in place, it's like they can go to the past, they can kind of change the past, and with this block model that is the current perception of what time is like, they kind of think everything has already happened that will happen, so the
yeah.
future is also set in stone. But January starts having experiences where she's like, I don't think that's actually the case. So, were you kind of intentionally examining how, like, we can't change the past, but we do have agency to change the future if our behavior changes?
See, that's a really interesting rabbit hole question, and I feel like we can talk about that for the rest of the day. But I think
Yeah.
like my intention was I wanted to throw out some models just to create a basis for people, and free will versus determination is always like a really interesting concept. But honestly, like the
Yes.
thing that I was going for more than anything was just like that this stuff is completely unknowable, and that's why at the end you've got Mina
Oh, yeah.
basically saying like using the Sorel painting as an example, but also
Yeah.
like this the being like but you're just seeing a little bit, like it's way more complicated than this. You can't even process the
Yeah.
entirety of it, and it's like I'm
Yeah.
kind of fascinated by that idea of like the challenge of our limitations when it comes to our perception of it,
Hmm.
because like at the end of the day, like whatever theories there are never going to be 100% correct, because there's things like even if we
Right.
kind of got it right, we probably can't get it fully right because we just can't. It
Yeah.
just feels so beyond the grasp of what we can process and understand. So I think
Yeah.
what I was kind of trying to get for was that like the answer kind of doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what's right or what's wrong.
Yeah.
It just really matters like
Yeah.
what choice you make.
Yeah, it really is. There's some part of like learning how to accept just what is instead of needing to have all of the answers. And kind of from
Yeah.
that, her thoughts about the trillionaires pretty often are about how like power can so quickly corrupt people who are just constantly looking for more and more power. And that it's just like what it does to a person in the way that it corrupts them. So were they there also kind of as the contrast to being able to accept what is and not be trying to like constantly exert your own agenda and make things conform to what you want?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, a rich person is always going to be a great villain. No one gets rich and powerful without
Yeah.
stepping people along the way. And I liked
Yeah.
playing with this idea of like, you've got a couple of these guys who like their reasons for wanting to take over time travel are not necessarily bad. Like you've got this like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia who wants to like reverse this like really terrible tragedy on his country, and it's like,
Yep.
how do you argue with that? And you've got the guy who runs the
Right.
social
Yeah.
media company who like, I mean, he's surely got some nefarious ideas, but also thinks like, hey, maybe this is a way to fix
Yeah.
climate change because like we can go back and change things. And like,
Right.
it's these ideas of like, but at the same time, they've got all these people around them telling them like, this is a bad idea, you shouldn't do it. And they're like, but I don't understand the word no. And I think that's a very
Yeah.
specific type among powerful men in particular who like you can't like the word
Hmm.
no isn't in their vocabulary. It doesn't exist to them, at least
Yeah.
in regards to like receiving it. Like they can't understand someone telling them no because to their mind,
Right.
because they're rich and powerful, they're always successful and they're always right and they're infallible. And so,
Hmm.
you know, it was kind of fun to like have these guys as the villains, but also kind of like trying to like humanize them and not make them like completely over
Yeah.
the top. Um,
Yeah.
it was a weird balancing act, but it was a lot of fun.
And with her, as you called her, acerbic wit, it was pretty funny having someone like that thinking about them too.
Yeah.
She had some pretty funny thoughts about them. So Cameo has this beautiful metaphor for loss that they explain to January, and they say loss is an injury. Like any injury, it triggers a pain response, and that pain response can be overwhelming. But injuries are supposed to activate a healing response too. That's why loss hurts less over time, and one day it's just a scar. The evidence of it never goes away, but the pain does, unless it gets infected and then it doesn't heal. And the way that they described the infected way, basically, that January is dealing with Mina's death was just poetic and perfect for her character, especially. But do you think January was almost kind of okay with keeping the wound infected because that at least meant it was still there? And like if the pain went away, would she still remember her?
Oh yeah, no, she was like all in on that. Like she thought it was the only thing she
Yeah.
had left. She was kind of like
Yeah.
torturing herself, and
Oh, yeah.
it's. I also was reading into like grief while I was writing this, and I found this thing called complicated
Hmm.
grief. Like I mentioned it in the book, and that's a real thing. And it's like
Yeah.
you literally believe that the person's just gonna walk back into the room, and and so it was
Right.
like, oh wow, this is kind of perfect because January's in a position where Mina keeps
Perfect.
walking
Yeah.
back into the room, and yeah, like
Right.
it's and I read that about how like grief is a pain like triggers a pain response, but also needs to trigger a healing response. And when I was thinking
Yeah.
about it in those terms, I'm like, oh yeah, no, like that makes a lot of sense. And so it was
Hmm.
kind of God, I love Cameo. Cameo was such a fun character to write, and having them sort of like
Yeah.
I loved having them kind of like come in and provide that like little bit of you've got these people who are kind of pushing January to try to be better and to try to like be more because they're all basically like a family. They're a found family, and like
Yes.
as much as January doesn't want to admit it, she's very much the matriarch of it, but she just doesn't want to accept that responsibility because she's afraid of what it's going to take away from her own life. And the book is
Hmm.
basically about trying to get, like beat that into her and get her to recognize the importance of this.
Yeah. And finally, at the end or near the end, is starting to feel something other than anger and or than anger and numbness. And the first thing that she actually notices she's feeling is shame. And so I kind of thought, like, okay, she's a fun character. She's just going to be a stereotypically grumpy detective this whole book. But she does eventually have the emotional growth to get to a point where she does feel shame, actually. So how did you know that the breakthrough feeling for January would actually like need to be shame for her to be able to access her other feelings?
I think it's the one that's like, because it's almost embarrassing, like this feeling of
Yeah.
all these people really love me and are sticking their neck out for me, and I just keep on spitting in their faces, and like,
Yeah.
because she has a capacity to care and to love and to, do good things, but it just comes down to this place of like, all of a sudden she realizes like everything she's been given and how much she hasn't given back, or the things she's given back that have been like hurtful. And yeah, like I think shame is a place you would hope someone would go in that instance, because you would want them to recognize like sort of like the wreckage they've created. And that's sort of the entryway to her kind of realizing like, oh, like this is not okay, and I need to start like being more
Yeah.
mindful.
Yeah, it is typically once you can feel that. I feel like because Mina says something to her about that earlier in the book, where she's like, if you can feel bad about what you're doing, that means you like know how to choose differently.
Yeah.
And so it made sense then at the end that like really coming face to face with how she felt bad about it is what like opened her up to everyone again.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, she's not a sociopath. She's just kind of a jerk.
Right. So, near the end, also, Mina is explaining to January about nirvana. And she says the secret of nirvana is that the path to achieving it is a paradox. Like any goal, you think you should be working towards it, but to truly achieve nirvana, you have to let it wash over you. You can't fight it or struggle over it. You get there by surrendering, not by trying. And at the end, January really is able to surrender to what is actually happening, and it allows her to actually save her Sangha or her chosen family that has been a theme throughout the book as well. So, when you started writing, did you know that you were setting out to create a character whose arc would kind of all be based around that paradox of nirvana?
Oh yeah, yeah. And again, like that's something that's always kind of stuck out to me in some of the readings
Mm-hmm.
I've done about Buddhism, is that the path to nirvana, it's about like surrendering and not trying. And that's
Mm-hmm.
actually a concept that's like very common across a lot of Eastern thought, is just sort of like
Yeah.
allowing instead of trying. And and like an
Mm-hmm.
example I really like too is like jumping rope. It's like, when you're jumping rope, if you're thinking about it, if you're trying too hard, you keep on tripping over the rope. But if you just kind of like allow your body to just remember what it's doing and just take over and just kind of like be with the feel, like you'll fall into this flow state. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's like this. I love this idea of it's this thing that you try for that you can't really be trying for. You just have to allow it into your
Yeah.
into yourself. And it is kind of
Yeah.
like a weird paradox.
It really is. It would. I know. I mentioned I had done. I've done therapy, and I think that's part of what was really good about rereading it too, was remembering being super closed off. But the other thing I used to want to do all the time was think that I could control everything and that I could just try to get better, and like I would eventually like reach perfection basically. And there was actually a podcast I was listening to a couple months ago where the host was saying, she was like, I decided for 2022 that my New Year's resolution is not self improvement, it's self acceptance. And she was like, I need to quit like trying and like reaching and thinking I'm gonna like reach this perfect version and then that's gonna be the good version of me. And I was like, wow, I had to like journal about that one and think about that one. But it that paradox, same similar paradox there. It's literally the hardest thing for me still, because you like want to be striving for things in general, but you do struggle less when you're able to just like accept things as they are.
Yeah, it's so hard, because I think in a general sense we're so trained and so expecting of wanting answers, of there being like an answer or solution,
Mhm.
or like something at the end of the
Yeah.
road that we're working toward, when I think in reality it's just, you just got to do the best you can. And
Yeah.
Everything else will kind of like fall into place if you do. And sometimes accepting that is hard.
Yeah, it really is. January also realizes near the end that the girl she's been seeing everywhere is actually her younger self. And she thinks, she's like, how did I not recognize my own self? And I thought that was so brilliant because that was what she was doing most of the story too, was if you kind of go into the parent child model of yourself, like your child self is the one having the feelings, and she was like not trying to feel those feelings. So how did
Yeah.
you come up with that awesome idea to like display her literally not recognizing her child self?
So that was interesting because I wrote the whole book. I sent it to some
Mhm.
friends, and then I did another edit, and then I sent it to my agent, and then I sent it to my editor. And my editor's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant story technician. He did
Yeah.
like The Martian, he did Ready Player One, like guy knows what he's doing. And he
Oh
sent me
wow.
back my edit letter, which was
Yeah.
huge. And and we were talking about like the emotional arc and what like the next step was going to be, and sort of like addressing some of the issues that he brought up. And I had this idea in the back of my head of like this creepy kid wandering around the hotel, because I just wanted to. It started with I just
Yeah.
wanted to like up the creep factor a little bit, and then kind of it sort of
Mhm.
morphed into this idea of like, oh, like maybe it's January seeing a previous version of herself, and this version of her is kind of like stalking her around the
Yeah.
hotel. And
Yeah.
so I mentioned it offhand to my editor, thinking that he would say no, because it was a fairly big change to make
Yeah.
pretty late in the game. And he was like, okay, I don't hate it. I don't think it's going to work, but, give it a shot. Just see what happens. And it
Yeah.
ended up working out so, like, I was so happy with how, and it made that emotional note at the end where she's finally able to, like, forgive herself. I was like, I was
Yeah.
sobbing when I wrote that scene.
I was choked up. I was like, that's so powerful.
And the only thing that we didn't keep, because initially I had the girl wearing like a creepy bunny mask because I just thought that would be like cool and a cool
Yep.
visual. Because also at this point, like it's being developed for TV, and I just thought that would be like a really awesome visual. And
Um,
then it was like,
nice.
and he was like, okay, all of this works except the mask. The mask just doesn't work because there's no reason for it. It's just I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, okay, that's a fair point. And
Right.
so I kind of then just sat and thought with it for a bit. I was like, no, like someone who's in this much denial and who is like this preoccupied with everything in front of them, who can't sort of self-reflect. I think there's a fair argument to be made that they would sort of like take
Hmm.
traumatic memories and bury them down in order to not deal with them to the point where they
Hmm.
become unrecognizable. So yeah, it was
Yeah.
funny because it was such a late edition, but I knew that there was like there was just something missing. There was just some like emotional note that was
Hmm.
missing, and then adding that in kind of like brought the whole
Yeah.
thing full circle for me.
It really did. I really can't say enough good things about the ending. I mentioned that before we were in the spoilers, but it is hard to nail. And that was part of it for me that I was like, okay, so that was really great too. The other thing that was so cool was January being able to save her found family the way that she did. And then there was this beautiful conclusion that she and Mina are actually kind of still there together, and they're kind of watching over, they're basically, they still get to be fixtures of the hotel and interact with this family that they both found at the hotel. So would you say that they are both bodhisattvas now from what Mina brought up earlier in the book?
See, that's another really good question that we can spend all day talking about. And like, I don't.
Right.
I love the concept. It's a beautifully romantic concept that like people put off their
Yeah.
own enlightenment in order to help other people achieve it. And you
Hmm.
know, I don't know. I don't even know if it's a real thing, But I just love the idea
Right.
of like getting these two people to a place where they could be together, where they're in sort of like
Yeah.
this liminal space, like outside of time, and can just sort of like
Yeah.
be. And I mean, I had some thoughts on it one way, and then just recently, I don't know if I'm ever going to write it, but I did get a sequel idea, and that's partially
Yeah.
because, like in talking to the TV people, they were interested in like
Yep.
if I had an idea for a second season, or if this would be more of like a one-off limited series thing, and
Mhm.
initially for a while I was like, nah, I got nothing. It's like the Doctor Who problem. It's like every season ends with like, oh no, the time stream is going to be destroyed and the universe is going to end, and it's like it's hard to do that over and over again without it feeling like, kind of like, okay, we get
Played
it.
out.
And
Yeah.
and then I got this idea for how to kind of like take the concept of the book and just blow it out into something like almost completely different, but still within the same
Okay.
realm. And so yeah, like it's forcing me to kind of like rethink where those characters are in their journey, but I like
Right.
that. And I don't know if I'm ever gonna write
Yeah.
it, but we'll
Yeah.
see.
That is so exciting because I was thinking last night about it being turned into either a film or a TV show, and I was like, it really needs to be a TV show so it can
Oh
like
yeah.
have the time to explore all of this stuff. So I'm so excited that it's going to be.
I mean, well, it's sort of like it's not a done deal yet. Essentially, it was
Right, right.
optioned. I just saw the pilot script recently, the final version of it. They did
Ooh,
such a brilliant job. The writer who they hired,
oh, that's awesome.
I mean, really just knocked it out of the park. He's such a smart guy, and he
That's
added all
amazing.
this world building stuff that like it's so good. I'm jealous of. I wish I had thought of it, and now
That's
it's
a
just like
relief.
next steps. Oh yeah, no, they did a good job. And now we just kind of see what the next steps are, and I don't know. It's like this stuff is so weird because like everything is like gung ho and exciting until like one day it's not. So
Right,
right now it looks like it's
especially
pretty
in
good.
Hollywood.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, where can people follow you so they can stay up to date on that so that we all can know when it does come out, if it does come out, where it comes out, and then just any more of your books, just kind of plug wherever they can follow you.
Yeah, sure. I'm on the web at robwhart.com, on Instagram at robwhart1, on Twitter at just robwhart. Um, Paradox Hell Paradox Hotel is my latest book, but you can also find my last book, The Warehouse, which is about what would happen if Amazon kind of took over the entire economy and built like company towns, and that was a fun one too. And yeah,
So, I will have all of those links in the show notes so everyone can go there if they want to go find that. And thanks for talking with me today.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.